Today, we're going to talk about which rook to move. Should be simple, right? Well, you would think so, but did you know that in a good part of the world, they actually drive on the wrong side of the road? Sorry to all my Aussie, South African, Namibian, British, and Thai friends. I kid. But seriously, you should drive on the right. Let's get back to chess. In this position, it's actually very easy to figure out where the rook should go because there are open files on the board. There is no way you would want to put the A rook on the E file because where's this rook moving? Yeah, he's in a traffic jam. He's blocked by the F pawn. And we're not going to be moving that F pawn anytime soon. So we've got two open files, and the simplest method of figuring out where to put the rooks is to put them on the open files. So this rook should go to E1, this rook should go to D1, and white will be very happy. In fact, if you had chosen the wrong rook, this rook is not going to get to the 7th rank because black's knight will go to C6, and then this rook is wondering why you buried him alive. Yeah, I don't know either. Let's go back to our starting position, put the rook back and the knight back. Now, if we change the position slightly, Fun Master Mike has some magical powers. We're going to put the pawns on these squares. Now, again, it's pretty easy. We have two open files on the chessboard, and if you are the white team, you'd want to put the king's rook on D1 and the queen's rook on C1. Now, let's move along to a little bit more complicated chess position. Here, we have no open files, so we have to put on our thinking caps. I don't think it makes much sense to just put the rooks in the middle of the board. When you don't have any open files, you should think about which files are about to become open and then put your rooks on those files. That's a little pro tip from Fun Master Mike to your brain. So in this position, we want to figure out which white pawn is likely to advance and which files are about to become open. Well, you might remember this rule about when pawns are in a chain, it's kind of like aiming at which way to attack. These pawns are aiming at the black king, and so white really wants to play pawn to f4. In fact, you could play it right away, but because today's subject is all about rooks, I think what we should do first is put the rook on A1 to E1. And the reason is simple. If we trade this pawn for this pawn, then this pawn will not be blocked anymore. And in fact, you can probably see if the E pawn comes forward, it would be a fork. So we've chosen the correct rook for white. Now, if you're black, you don't really have a lot of opportunity to push those center pawns. If you move the F rook, what I'm worried about is that you weaken the F7 pawn. That's actually a pretty important thing to consider when you're deciding which rook to move. And we're going to come back to that later. So if I was black, I would move my rook on A8 to C8 because I think this is the most likely pawn to come forward. And black would really love to play C4 and try to make this bishop blocked from aiming at his own king. But you know what? White comes first. White's going to play F4, and as we already said, if black makes a trade, this pawn's going to come forward one day. But you know what? If the black queen moves over, let's say to E7 to guard the pawn, then white can play knight F5. That knight's too strong, you got to get rid of it. But after E takes, now you can see where we put this rook on the E file. This pawn is in a really bad pin, and I think white must be in a winning position. Okay, now we're going to move on, and we're going to look at a Judith Polgár chess game. Now here we've got a lot going on. We've got an isolated pawn for each side. White has this really strong knight on an outpost. And I'll be honest with you, when I first looked at this chess position, I thought it was going to be great for the video, but I actually got it wrong. That's right, it was back to chess school for Fun Master Mike. Here, I thought this rook should guard this pawn, and we should use the other rook to come to the C file and attack the C7 pawn, which is kind of a backward pawn. If you forget what that is, you might want to go back a few levels and review your pawns. So, my thinking was to play rook on F to D1, but here's the problem. After black doubles rooks on the D file, now we want to put a rook on the C file, but no matter which one we put there, we're going to have some back rank problems. For example, if we play rook on A1 to C1, looks like our rooks are in the right spot. But after rook takes pawn, our rook on D1's in danger. If we trade rooks, and then we take on C7, you see what's coming. We get mated on the first rank. And if we go back to this position, we can even try the other rook. We just moved it, we'll move it again. And if he takes, we take on C7, but rook D1 is mate in 2. We all know about those back rank tactics. So if we go back and we go to the Judith Polgard chess school, it's a better school, isn't it? Yeah. She played rook on a1 to d1. Notice sometimes I can't give you exact rules. You actually just have to do analysis. Now, here comes the really amazing thing. After black doubles rooks, look what she does now. She moves the exact same rook back to c1. Now, how often in chess do we waste a tempo on purpose? Not often, but that's why she's the best female chess player of all time. And here, black really did not want to take and allow white to invade on the 7th rank. That was not a trade that black was very happy with. So black chose to move his rook back to f7, and then Judith played rook on f1 to d1, and look at that. She actually got her rooks where they belonged, but she did it using really exact analysis. If you're this far in the king levels, you probably know I can't always give you an exact rule. Sometimes you have to do the analysis. Here comes a chess.com member game that I found, and I think it's really instructive. So in this position, again, white's trying to figure out which files are about to become open. And white figures correctly that black may want to play e5. So white plays rook on a1 to d1. Now, if black plays the move d5, actually, there's a very strong pin on the d file. I'm going to let you work out why black loses material after pawn takes pawn. I'm not even going to do it in the video. You're going to work it out on your own. Okay, so white moved the rook to d1, and black says, okay, I've got to get my queen off of the d file. You probably figured out why. And the queen's only option is to go to the e file. But look what white does now. White puts a rook on the e file, and even though it may not look like there's an opportunity, trust me, that rook is going to go after the queen. Now, black played e5, but white played e4. Exactly in line with what we said. You want to put your rooks behind pawns that are about to move. Now, black really does not want to trade pawn 2. No. After rook takes, now the e-pawn is in a very bad pin, and we see exactly why white put the rooks on the 2 files that he did. In the game, black played f4. Now, after takes, takes, I'll go ahead and tell you that after bishop h3, white is winning at least a pawn in all variations. And again, I'm going to have you work that one out for yourself. But instead, we had some other moves, which we're going to sort of go through quickly. f3, and then we had g4, and these aren't actually very good moves for white, but the very interesting thing is in this position, after choosing the correct rook, now white chooses the wrong rook. What? White wanted to triple rooks on the d file. So you might think, okay, I can move this rook up and this rook over, or I can move this rook up and this rook over. Doesn't matter, right? Actually, it does. Unfortunately for white, white chose rook to e2, and then after the devastating move, rook to d6, white had to resign because there's no saving the rook on d1. But if we back up for a second, if we had chosen the other rook, watch what would have happened. Then, after rook to d6, we can play queen takes, winning a pawn and amazingly guarding our rook. Again, you just have to do the exact analysis to see why that was the better rook. And now we move on to probably the most famous example of all time. Guy named Bobby Fischer as black. Ever heard of him? I hope so. This was from a US championship game. Now, it looks like, because there are 2 open files for white, that the 2 white rooks belong on these 2 squares. But remember I told you there are some other considerations, sometimes those being defensive reasons? Well, white played rook on f to d1, which looks accurate, but it turns out that this rook needed to stay guarding the f2 pawn. That was actually more important than putting your rooks on the open files. It's very hard in chess to make all of these balancing act between rook aggressiveness, rook defensiveness, but if you're this far in the king levels, I'm sure you can handle it. And here is how Bobby Fischer won quite amazingly. He played knight d3, targeting this newly weakened pawn. And then he made an amazing sacrifice. Why does this work? Well, we're going to see. Okay, he just got a second pawn for his knight. And then he took the bishop, not the rook. And here, he's got a light squared bishop, so he sacrifices the pawn just to open up the really long light square diagonal. And in this position, after a king f1, everybody in the room thought white was just winning. And when black made a move and they found out the game was over, they thought that white had won. But actually, it's black that had won. There is no defending all of the different bishop and rook and queen open lines. So the threat is to play check with our queen. And then when your king moves over, this queen is overworked. She's trying to guard the knight, and she's trying to guard a helper checkmate. So here's one way the game could have ended. Let's say white plays queen f2. Now the rook guards the knight.
No.
But here is what Bobby Fischer had planned.
Check.
Queen check. Pretty much have to move your king over. And now there is a way to make the queen overworked, but we have to trick the rook into moving away from the knight. The sacrifices would have continued. Rook e1 check. Don't take with the queen. Queen g2's mate. And after takes, now we distract the white queen with bishop takes. The only way to save the queen, really, is to take back. And we finally diverted the queen to g2 mate. Pretty hard to see which rook in all these examples. This is a pretty complicated lesson. You might want to watch this one a second time. And remember, kids, always drive on the correct side of the road. Can't tell you what that is because I don't know where you're from.